class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a very early look at what the Sharks' forward lineup could look like at the beginning of the 24-25 season. Over the last few weeks, Mike Grier has made multiple moves through trades, through the draft, and through free agency to acquire a bunch of players so that this roster will look very different than what it did at the beginning of last season. But one name that is conspicuously missing from my list here today is Logan Couture. I touched a bit on this topic during my free agency review video, but I mentioned that Alex Wennberg's signing may have been an indication that Logan Couture will not be ready for the upcoming season and perhaps may not even play in the upcoming year at all. Couture only got 6 games this past year due to a lingering issue, a lingering injury, and the way he has talked about it seems as though this is something that he may have to live with for the rest of his life, and perhaps he might not actually be able to get into game action again. There's no confirmation, there's no conclusion that can truly be drawn here. It's certainly possible that Couture will be ready for game 1, but for the purpose of this video, I will assume Couture will not be in the lineup come October time, and that is going to be the case for the rest of it. To start off here, we have the Sharks' top 6, and this is where things are pretty clear for San Jose. Last year, as we know, they didn't really have a ton of top 6 options past like their top 3 players, plus Tomas Hertl prior to him getting traded. This year, they're getting some reinforcements, but not so much that it is necessarily much of a challenge to narrow down who's going to be the Sharks' top 6. We have Eklund, Zetterlund, Granlund, Celebrini, Tyler Toffoli, and probably also Will Smith. The reason I give that bit of a caveat, an asterisk to Will Smith, is that there is a possibility of him being sort of interchanged slightly between the top 6 as well as the third line. It seems as though Mike Grier and Ryan Warsofsky might want to ease Will Smith into it slightly, and as we saw last season with Eklund occasionally being given bottom 6 time to get him some easier competition to play against, the same thing could very well happen with Will Smith. On top of that, Will Smith is a natural center, a position that is taken up by both Mikael Granlund and Macklin Celebrini in the Sharks' top 6, so if they want him playing his natural position, the next best option is as the third line center. Combined with those easier matchups, that could be a decent spot for Smith if things aren't necessarily working well in the top 6, and someone like Wennberg could take his spot. But I think at the beginning of the season, as long as Smith has a productive training camp and preseason, he should be given the opportunity to run with a top 6 slot. He seems comfortable when playing the wing, and so for the early parts of his career here, that can be the chance, at least until Granlund is gone, perhaps as soon as next year or even the trade deadline of this upcoming season. The major questions more so with the Sharks lineup come with the bottom 6. It's not the center position, as that is rather clear cut. We have Wennberg as the third line center, with of course the possibility of Will Smith taking up that role, as well as Nico Sturm as the fourth line center. The real question marks come with who will play the wing positions on these bottom 2 lines, because Mike Grier has made so many moves to acquire these types of players that now it is an absolute logjam of players who are capable of playing in the NHL level and perhaps even deserving of getting that spot as well. We will first talk about the group of players that Mike Grier specifically brought in to play in a bottom 6 role, that being Luke Kunin, Barclay Goodrow, Ty Dellandrea, and Carl Grundstrom. Kunin could have been allowed to walk. He didn't need a new contract, but Grier specifically signed him. Goodrow was on waivers. The Sharks did not need to pick him up, but Grier went out of his way to take him and his pretty bad contract. Dellandrea was with the Dallas Stars, and Grier traded a draft pick to bring him over. Carl Grundstrom is the only one who is slightly borderline because of the fact that he was in a player-for-player trade for Kyle Burroughs, so it's technically not the same type of situation, but is still a player who Mike Grier wanted on the team. So there's a very real possibility that these 4 players were acquired so that they would play games, not so that they would ride on the bench, and that they will be the 4 wingers to play for the San Jose Sharks in this upcoming season in the Sharks' bottom 6. But if that is the case, you are locking out a lot of players who are deserving of a chance in the NHL. The first player to talk about in that particular role would be Klim Kostin. He's kind of like that weird wild card type of position for the San Jose Sharks, where he could be someone playing in the Sharks' bottom six, and I wouldn't be that surprised to see it, but at the same time, he could be a 13th forward, and I still wouldn't be all that surprised. The reason being is that Klim Kostin, over his relatively short career, has shown himself to be a pretty inconsistent player, and has failed to really find much of a home with any of his previous teams, St. Louis, Edmonton, or Detroit. And so it's not necessarily a guarantee that he'll actually be able to turn things around completely for San Jose. While he was quite good down the stretch for the San Jose Sharks at the end of this past season after being acquired from the Detroit Red Wings in that trade for Radim Shemek, the Sharks have been burned in a situation like this before with Jacob Peterson. At the end of the 22-23 season, Peterson was looking really, really good and seemed like the type of guy who could be penciled into perhaps even a top 6 role for the San Jose Sharks going into the 23-24 year. But as we know now, he had a pretty pitiful preseason, didn't make an impact, didn't make the team, played the entire year pretty much with the Barracuda, and didn't even end up getting a qualifying offer with the San Jose Sharks. So theoretically, the same thing could happen to Kostin. So again, while he could make the lineup, and I wouldn't be that surprised to see it, there's a very real chance he doesn't manage to make that impact. The real sort of gate-kept players here come with the Sharks' younger talent, and primarily with the two players that stand out, Thomas Bordeleau and Danil Gushchin. To start off with Gushchin, he has spent the last couple of years with the Barracuda honing his game and getting better, at least from an offensive standpoint. A couple of years he put up some pretty good numbers with the Barracuda. This past season he was close to a point per game with them, and that is on a very bad San Jose Barracuda team that didn't make it to the playoffs in the AHL, so he was leading the way in that regard. And in the 6 games, a very limited sample size, but in the 6 games that he has been given at the NHL level, he's managed to put up 4 points. So in limited NHL time on some pretty bad San Jose Sharks teams and not the best situations, he has managed to maintain a certain level of productivity. And so, at this point of his developmental career, you would think that that next step would actually be getting some NHL games. And I'm not trying to say that he is deserving of a full 82-game season, but a chance to play 5-6 games, a couple of weeks in the NHL, truly see if he can actually hang around instead of just being like given 1 to 2 games right at the end of the season when the entire Sharks team had checked out, which is the case of what happened at the end of last year. This is really where his development should be taking him, but with players like Dellandrea, Grundstrom, Kunin, Goodrow all seemingly above him on the depth charts at this point, it's difficult to imagine him actually getting a spot, which can be quite frustrating. But in fact, the worst situation is not with Gushchin, because at the very least, he would just be remaining stagnant by playing another year with the Barracuda. The worst situation actually occurs with the Sharks prospect Thomas Bordeleau, because he has already proven himself capable of playing in a relatively small sample size of games. He played pretty much the last quarter of the season with the San Jose Sharks this past year, and while many of the other Sharks forwards were faltering and not putting up really good performances near the end of the season, Bordeleau was actually one of the few bright spots for San Jose down the stretch. Put up 11 points in 27 games, relatively productive when you consider the 5-on-5 lines that he was playing with in those games. And I thought, indeed, he looked really, really good, to the point where I think he is deserving of getting a full-time spot in the lineup for the San Jose Sharks for this upcoming season. That would be the step forward in his development. If he heads back to the AHL, that's not a stagnant move like with Gushchin, but is instead a step back, which is something that the Sharks should specifically be avoiding. As much as Mike Grier is looking to be better for this upcoming season and trying to improve the team, he should not be delusional enough to believe that this is going to be a team that is actually competitive for a playoff spot. Most people still have the Sharks finishing near, if not in, the bottom 5 of the NHL teams, and many even have the Sharks still being last place in the league for this upcoming season. Remember, the Sharks last year were so bad that they put up the worst regular season in modern NHL history. So even a 20-point improvement over that still sees the Sharks finish quite low in the standings, and that would be an absolutely crazy jump in terms of production. And so the Sharks priorities this season should not necessarily be in winning, but should instead be in developing. And they are doing that rather well with Celebrini and Smith. They have insulated these players with players like Tyler Toffoli and perhaps Alex Wenberg if Smith ends up playing with him to try and sort of get them in a good position. But those are the only two young forwards making their debut or expected to make their debut and really develop their game. Eklund has already kind of graduated from that particular role. And I think you can fit another one of those players, at least another one, in your bottom six. And the Sharks are just not in a position to squander these young players' developments. As much as we love to talk about some of the other Sharks prospects that they have in the system, outside of those lock type of players like a Will Smith, a Celebrini, where it seems like an inevitability that they will become impact players in the NHL, for players like Edstrom or Biestet or Haltunen or Chernyshov, while these guys are looking promising in their respective junior leagues and over the seas leagues like that, there is no guarantee that any of them actually manage to make it to the NHL. There is no telling that in 3 years' time those guys will become impact players in the major leagues. And so when you look at a player like Bordeleau, who's already 90% of the way there, he has already proven himself in the NCAA, proven himself in the AHL, proven himself capable of playing NHL games on a consistent basis. You only need him to prove himself to be a full-time NHLer. And so to toss him to the side here and say, well, I'm sure later down the line we'll have prospects come in, that is a very bold call and something that just doesn't really seem to be the case. Now, I'm not sort of trying to advocate for him getting a free spot in the lineup. Obviously, there still needs to be a good performance through training camp and preseason for him to earn a spot. I'm not just trying to say that a young player should be given a role on the team because they are a young player and should be developed. For a player like Colin Graf, who got a small chunk of games at the end of last season and was not particularly impressive, I believe Colin Graf does not deserve an NHL spot, at least currently. Never know what might happen in preseason, but currently, he should be an AHL starter next year. But Bordeleau is not in that category. And if I truly believed that there would be a perfect meritocracy for the spots in the Sharks' bottom six for this upcoming season, I wouldn't necessarily be upset. If every single player vying for a spot in that bottom six was starting from square one, it wouldn't be the end of the world. But the fact is that I foresee, and it's backed up by many, many years of experience watching NHL hockey, I foresee that players like Bordeleau and Gushchin will start from home plate. Meanwhile, players like Cunnin and Goodrow will be starting from third base, ready to run home pretty much instantly. They're already 80% of the way there. They simply just need to prove that they can skate still at an NHL level, and they'll be handed a lineup spot no matter what. There is a very real future where someone like Luke Cunnin plays 3 preseason games, puts up 0 points, is a -2, and doesn't look spectacular at all, and in fact looks quite bad. Meanwhile, someone like Danil Gushchin puts up a goal and 2 assists, 3 points, is a +1, and still doesn't manage to get a lineup spot over Luke Cunnin. Because these young players don't necessarily have to outperform the more veteran guys. They don't just have to be better. They have to be overwhelmingly better so that the coach takes such a notice that they simply cannot justify not having them in the lineup. If Bordeleau or Gushchin are only marginally better than these players, or even just a decent bit better, that is simply not going to be enough to actually take that spot away. So while I truly believe a player like Bordeleau is better statistically than both Cunnin and Goodrow quite easily, the same is not thought about the Sharks coaching staff. While I'm obviously not 100% familiar with what the approach that Warsofsky is going to take, based on quotes that he has given about Luke Cunnin as a player, it seems as though his lineup spot is not remotely in jeopardy. And so for Bordeleau, he has to be so perfect through training camp to eventually get this spot that it's hard to imagine that will end up being the case. And so indeed, if both Gushchin and Bordeleau are kept outside of the lineup here, it will result in a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, which makes people believe that one of, if not both of these prospects could end up getting traded prior to the beginning of next season. If I personally had to choose which of these I'd like to see go, I would have to go with Danil Gushchin for the primary reason of the fact that we have seen Bordeleau perform in the NHL, and we already know he can hang around at that top level compared to Gushchin, who through no fault of his own hasn't been given that opportunity. But also on top of that, Bordeleau does seem to fit the the Mike Greer mold slightly more, even though both are relatively undersized players. Bordeleau has that hard-working capability. He wins battles along the boards. He's willing to go to the dirty areas to score goals. And on top of that, Bordeleau has the natural ability to play the center position. It is slightly forgotten because he is always playing the wing in the NHL, but as a centerman, he has a very good instinct in that particular role, and primarily he's also very good in the face-off dot. This past season, Bordeleau was third on the team in terms of face-off percentage, and if you exclude Tomas Hertl from that, since he's no longer with San Jose, he was actually second. And teams love to have lines with two players who are capable of taking a face-off, because frequently linesmen will kick out the first center to line up for the draw, and you need to bring somebody else in. To have Bordeleau as that second option, or even as that first option, is very good, and so that is an advantage over someone like Gushchin. So if I did have to choose, I would trade Gushchin, but personally I'd rather keep both of them, but that just doesn't really seem to be in the cards for the San Jose Sharks. And so if we finally move on to what I have here as a prospective lineup for San Jose, it's kind of a mix of what I expect to happen and what I do hope to happen. If I was delusional enough, I would have, Bordeleau and Gushchin here in the lineup, because I do think that's a smart move for the San Jose Sharks as they build towards the future, but I don't really think that's going to end up being the case. And if I was truly realism downer, sort of pessimist, I would also have a lineup featuring neither of these two players. So I've kind of split it down the middle, where this is, I think, a good compromise for where the Sharks could go. And we start off in the top six, this top line. There were a couple of rules that I kind of followed when it came to designing what the top six would look like for San Jose. The first of which was to keep both Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini separate from each other, especially right at the beginning of the season. I don't expect the Sharks to want to have two extremely inexperienced rookies playing their first career games in the NHL to be on the same line. That might not be that much of a recipe for success. So while eventually Celebrini and Smith might get some reps together, I don't think that's how they want to start the year, so they were kept separate. At the same time, the Sharks have two experienced veteran players in their top six in Granlund and Toffoli, and I would imagine that since Celebrini and Smith will also be separate, that they're going to want one of each of those players on each of the two lines. And so I ended up settling here on a top line, sort of, this is kind of interchangeable, this could be the first or the second line, of Eklund, Celebrini, and Toffoli. This would be a very fun line to watch. Toffoli, a proven scorer at the NHL level, 30 plus goals multiple times, including this past season, playing with a creative sort of hybrid playmaker slash shooter in a player like William Eklund, as well as Macklin Celebrini, highly touted prospect. This could be an extremely exciting line to watch and would be a really good one for San Jose. And then when it comes to the second line, I have Granlund with Zetterlund and Smith. We know from last season Granlund has a good amount of chemistry with Fabian Zetterlund, and so I think they would be able to incorporate Will Smith rather well into that fold. We also know from the development camp that Smith has the ability to find some chemistry quite quickly with whoever he happens to be playing with. Zetterlund, maybe not the same caliber of scorer as a player like Tyler Toffoli, still has that aspect in his game, was the leading scorer for the San Jose Sharks this past season with 24 goals. Granlund also a pure playmaker, so that will help not only the playmaking side of Will Smith in the case of Zetterlund, but also the shooting side, and that will help him continue that development forward. So I think this will be a significantly better Sharks top six for them compared to last season. And then when it comes to the bottom six, I have a third line of Bordeleau with Wenberg and Dellandrea. Bordeleau, like I said, I want him in the lineup. I think he's deserving of a lineup spot, and the Sharks really should try to continue to develop the prospects that have proven themselves capable in that role, instead of just bringing in random guys who in 3 to 5 years will clearly not still be on the roster. If they actually manage to handle Bordeleau correctly, in 3 to 5 years, he could be a productive third, if not second liner for the San Jose Sharks. Pairing Bordeleau with Wenberg, I think, is a very good idea. Wenberg, still relatively decent offensively, though maybe he's somewhat far removed from his real successful seasons offensively in the NHL, but also quite responsible defensively. I think would be a really strong third line center for Bordeleau. And Dellandrea, I think, having that sort of pedigree of being a former first rounder, even if he doesn't necessarily have a ton of offense to his game, is kind of a well-rounded two-way type of player who I think complements this third line very well. And so while it's maybe not as off the page exciting as the top two lines, I think this would be a really solid third group for San Jose. The fourth line is where we go more so to the realism aspect of it, where I have Cunnin paired with Nico Sturm and Barclay Goodrow. Personally, I don't really think Cunnin and Goodrow should be on the same line. Both of these players fill the exact type of role, and both of them are absolute offensive and possession generally black holes. Barclay Goodrow had the worst possession numbers last season on the entire New York Rangers team, and you might be thinking, well, the New York Rangers were the President's Trophy winning team in the NHL. His numbers must have still been like pretty good relative to the Sharks, but that's actually not the case. His possession numbers, if put on San Jose last year, would have still been last place on the Sharks. So both Goodrow and Cunnin struggle immensely in that particular area. Having them both on the same line would probably mean that the Sharks would play in their own zone pretty much every single shift that they would get. And so it might be in the Sharks' best interest, if both of these players are going to be kept in the Sharks' top 12, that they would be separated. Possibly that they would have Bordeleau and Wenberg play with Luke Cunnin and then move Dellandrea down to play with Sturm and Goodrow. But I couldn't in good conscience stick Bordeleau with Cunnin. I've already seen enough of that in my lifetime, and I don't really want to see more of it. But if the Sharks kind of have to go with that role, I guess I would be okay with it. When it comes to the extra forwards in this situation, Carl Grundstrom is honestly somewhat interchangeable with Dellandrea. I'm not familiar enough with either of these two players' games to really make a choice of which one is better. It seems as though the Sharks value Grundstrom slightly more based solely on the fact that they signed him for more money. They gave him 1.8 compared to Dellandrea's 1.3. So even though I have Dellandrea currently in this third line role with Wenberg and Bordeleau, Grundstrom could just as easily fill this spot with probably little fall off. The training camp will probably be the opportunity for either of them to separate from the other. Klim Kostin, I already talked about a bit as that wild card. I currently don't have him in my starting lineup, but you never know what could happen. Personally, I hope he would take a player like Dellandrea, or in particular Luke Cunnin's spot in the lineup instead of someone like Bordeleau, but you never know what could end up happening. Givani Smith's name here is simply just because of the fact that he is still technically on the roster, but I suspect he probably won't get any games in the NHL for this upcoming season unless multiple injuries occur for the San Jose Sharks. There's a possibility if the Sharks want to go a slightly more physical route, he could get a spot if there's like 1 or 2 injuries that normally wouldn't put him into a lineup spot, but Warsofsky's willing to go there, but I highly doubt it. Justin Bailey was brought in, but on a 2-way contract, so like with Givani Smith, it's probably only going to be the case if there's like 3 or 4 injuries for the San Jose Sharks, or maybe perhaps later on in the year if they end up trading away a couple of players who are on expiring contracts like Granlund, like Sturm, like Luke Cunnin, but realistically he won't be much of a factor. When it comes to the younger players who could make an impact, Danil Gushin I've already talked about as well. He's someone who I think is deserving of being able to take that next step in the NHL, but it's just hard to really find much room for him. I personally would do so, but I don't know if Ryan Warsofsky will. Colin Graf, like I said, he played a few games at the end of the last season for the San Jose Sharks, wasn't particularly impressive. While he might be able to redeem himself, his development camp was actually rather good. I think he'll probably start next year in the AHL. And then Quentin Musty is the last player I want to talk about who's actually rather interesting. Musty was already relatively close to getting a 9-game stint at the beginning of last season. He seemed to be one of the last cuts made by the San Jose Sharks before they sent him back to the OHL. And after an extremely productive year there where he led the league in terms of points per game, his only sort of options at this point are either to play in the NHL, which seems to be his very lofty goals, or to head back to the OHL where there's not necessarily that much to learn. And while it's hard to imagine Musty managing to get a spot in the Sharks lineup, there is a technically small possibility he can get 9 games, again depending on how training camp goes. I certainly wouldn't be opposed to such a thing, but it is hard to imagine him holding down a spot for the entirety of the year. But that will do it for this video. Indeed, the Sharks have a ton of decisions to make, and we'll see the direction that they decide to go. There is seemingly a good choice and a bad choice here, and hopefully the Sharks make the good one. Class dismissed.